preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Hello, I'm here to introduce the introducer, and this evening that is an event. Benjamin Buttonwieser has been a close friend of the 92nd Street Y for many years, but that, I think, is a genetic trait in his family. Buttonwieser Hall, Buttonwieser Lounge, Buttonwieser Library, all bear their names for good reason. Mrs. Clarence Buttonwieser is a dedicated member of our board. Mr. Buttonwieser is also a close friend of Helen Suzman, and I think that that too must be traced to a readily identifiable trait, for he, in his own country, in his own way, has been as ardent a fighter for civil rights and for human rights as she has in hers. I'm proud to introduce him tonight, Benjamin Buttonwieser.
Ladies and gentlemen, after that introduction, I'm sorry to appear, because the facts may catch up with me. That was one of the nicest introductions I've ever received. Well, it's only the second best introduction I ever had. I had to preside an occasion like this, and the person who was supposed to introduce me didn't appear, so I introduced myself. I had a very flattering introduction, I assure you. There's been a lot mentioned about Buttonwieser Hall and all that, and I plead guilty to all of it proudly. I might say for very many reasons. I regret that my parents are no longer alive and couldn't have heard that. My father would have appreciated it. My mother would have believed it. So all in all, it's a very flattering introduction. Frankly, I feel extremely honored and privileged to have been accorded the distinction of introducing someone so renowned as Helen Suzman. May I also say that ordinarily it is a cardinal principle of presiding that the length of the introduction should be an inverse ratio to the fame of the person being introduced. On that principle, all I should really do is say, as one does when one introduces the President of the United States, the President of the United States. But Helen Suzman's inherent modesty, I think, so beclouds her attainments that it would not be fair to this audience not to tell you something about the great contributions that Mrs. Suzman has made, not merely in her own country, but throughout the world, on the subject of not just civil rights, but everything that has to do with improving the lot of her fellow man. At the very outset, may I say that I hope you will understand or grasp that the sincerity of what I'm trying to convey to you about Helen Suzman, my appraisal of her, is an inverse ratio to the poverty of my expression of it. Now, I ordinarily would not revert to notes, but it's Helen Suzman you want to hear, not me. However, as I indicated, it would be less than, I would be doing a disservice to you if I didn't try to capsulate just a few of her achievements. She was born in a suburb of South Africa. I hesitate a moment because, having been in the State Department, the difference between a gentleman and a diplomat is a gentleman remembers a woman's birth date. A diplomat only remembers her birthday. But I think you will glean that, though her looks may belie it, she was born in South Africa in 1917. She is a Bachelor of Commerce from the University of Witwatersrand. And I just want to tell you, even though it's spelled with a W, it's pronounced with a V. And I was very carefully instructed on that by our guest this evening. She was a lecturer in economic history at Witwatersrand from 1944 to 1952. She has been in Parliament in 28 years. She was elected in 1953 as a member of the United Party. She was an inaugural founding member of the Progressive Party in 1959, and she had a unique distinction. For 13 years, she was the sole member of that party. She picked up adherents, though, quite rapidly, because the Progressive Federal Party has been merged into it since 1974, and there are now 16 members. Helen Suzman is the guiding spirit and the dedicated, fearless voice of that party. In fact, she is the official opposition spokesman for a variety of matters, primarily in the field of civil rights. As to honors, they are legion. So I'll cite only those that I think are almost unique in this world. She was one of 4 individuals in the world who were accorded the honor, the United Nations Human Rights Award in 1978. She has a doctorate in civil law of Oxford, 1973. She has a Doctor of Laws from Columbia, Harvard, and Smith. I think she's listening, at least I hope I am. It wasn't because I happened to be a graduate of Columbia, but I put them alphabetically, lest she would say, oh, you're featuring Columbia. She's also an honorary fellow of St. Hugh's College of Oxford and an honorary fellow of the London School of Economics. I think you will agree that in light of the foregoing, it was said by another, I can't say lady from Africa because I'd have to put that in quotes, but Shakespeare did say of Cleopatra, age shall not wither, nor custom stale thy infant variety. And if you have her in your home as my Helen, we call her Helen B., and I've experienced, she has an infant variety of people calling, would she speak here, would she speak there? So we here at the Y this evening are indeed fortunate. I suppose I could go one step further in my simile. It's often been said that peace hath her victories no less renowned than war. I think that is true. We know a great deal about Florence Nightingale in Crimea. We know a good deal about Edith Cavell in Belgium. They brought help, they brought solace, they brought hope to the wounded. And so too has Helen Suzman brought help and solace and hope to millions who are victims of man's inhumanity to man. It's been said of Helen Suzman, and I quote, as a minority of one in Parliament, she represents more South Africans than all the other members combined. It's really difficult to encapsulate the brilliant, dedicated, courageous career of Helen Suzman. I think it's best epitomized by a poet who once said, the heights by great men reached and kept were not attained by sudden flight, but they, while their companions slept, were toiling upward in the night. It's my signal honor to present to you this heroine in the cause of human rights and humane decency, who labors for them so fearlessly, so relentlessly, and so effectively, both day and night. Mrs. Helen Suzman, the Member of Parliament for Houghton. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Buttenwieser, for those very kind, if somewhat exaggerated words. I want to say that I'm very honored indeed to have been invited to be part of the series, The Price of Dissent, which has been organized by the 92nd Street Y. And I must at once tell you, as I told Dr. Ruskay of the Y when he discussed this with me, that I'm really not in the same league as Mr. Timmerman and Mr. Kuznetsov, the other 2 members of this series. They indeed have paid the price of dissent, and a very heavy price it was. In Mr. Timmerman's case, 2.5 years of jail and torture in Argentina. In Mr. Kuznetsov's case, 7 years in prison and 8.5 years in labor camps in Soviet Russia. Not even people most hostile to South Africa could possibly equate the ghastly experiences endured by Mr. Timmerman and Mr. Kuznetsov with 28 years as an opposition member of parliament in South Africa. I have not been subjected to any restrictions. I have not served any terms of imprisonment, for voicing my dissent to the policies of the South African government, and I cannot therefore be said to have paid a price for dissent, other than perhaps the emotional price of chronic exasperation at the stupidity and at the injustice of many of the actions of the government of my country. In short, what I needed to have over all the years that I have been in the South African Parliament has been stamina rather than courage. I am essentially a survivor. I am now the second longest serving member of the South African Parliament. Longest serving, not the oldest, may I add. I am on to my 5th Prime Minister, so to speak. And with a little bit of luck, I hope to outlast this Prime Minister too. I think I attribute my capacity for survival to the genes that I inherited from my father, who emigrated to South Africa as a boy of 17, not speaking either English or Afrikaans, Dutch as the language then was known, from Lithuania at the turn of the century. He used to tell us that he came steerage because there was nothing cheaper. He had stamina and he survived. He did rather well, as a matter of fact. I count myself privileged at having had the opportunity of using the forum of Parliament in South Africa to oppose all those laws that violate human rights and the rule of law, to keep important issues alive, and to allow nothing to go by default. Those I believe to be the main job of an opposition member of Parliament. It is also, however, a source of satisfaction that on very many occasions I've been able to express views that I know blacks would have expressed better than I, had they had the right to speak in Parliament. And that as a member of Parliament who has paid special attention to civil rights matters, to prisons and police actions, I have, wherever possible, used my position to intercede on behalf of people who have been detained without trial, and to keep my beady eyes fixed on what goes on in prisons, to visit prisons such as Robben Island and Pretoria Central, where people like Mr. Nelson Mandela and others are held who have committed crimes against the state, as they are described in South Africa, as I did, in fact, a few months ago, in order to ensure that those prisoners are in good shape. And I'm happy to say they are in good shape. I'm also happy to say that conditions on the island have improved very much indeed since I was last allowed to visit, which was some 8 years previously. It is, I know, of immense importance to prisoners to know that someone outside cares, and that I believe to be one of the jobs which I must fulfill as the official opposition spokesman on prisons. But over and above all this, of course, has been the very sobering experience of having a ringside seat throughout all those years during which the jigsaw puzzle of apartheid has been completed, piece by piece, as law after law has been enacted, which in the process destroyed many basic human rights and eroded the rule of law in South Africa. Although many of the abrogations of human rights can be traced back, in fact, to long before the present regime came into power in 1948, there is no doubt that from the time that the National Party came into power, an entirely new era commenced as statute after statute was enacted to advance the policy of apartheid. Thus we have the Population Registration Act, which sets down at birth the ethnic, the racial group to which each person belongs, and in which group he will stay unless he is reclassified at some stage by the Population Registration Board for the rest of his life. And thereafter there is the Group Areas Act, which determines where everybody may live, own property, or trade according to race. There is the Urban Areas Act, which controls the mobility of black people from the rural areas to the so-called white urban areas. There is the Immorality Act, which controls sex across the colour line. There is the Mixed Marriages Act, which controls marriages across the colour line. There are the Education Acts, which re-entrench segregated education, which did indeed exist before the government came into power, but which extended segregation to university level. There was school segregation previous to that. Now there is university segregation. There is the job reservation law, which was extended from the mines where it existed from something like 1911, was extended to manufacturing industry in the 50s, which reserved certain skilled jobs for whites only. There was the Separate Representation of Parliament Act and other acts which removed from the blacks in the Cape Province, one of our states, those voting rights which they enjoyed previously. At present, no black person has the vote in South Africa. They vote, or rather vote for the Parliament of South Africa. They vote for their own institutions. The homeland legislative assemblies, in the case of the 9 black ethnic groups, and prior to its dissolution, the coloured people of mixed race, 2.5 million of them, voted for the Coloured Representative Council, and the Indians, 750,000, vote for the Indian Council. There are something like 18 million Africans in South Africa, and there are 5 million whites. Thus, in every facet of life, you will see, the aim was to separate the races in what is quite ineluctably a multiracial society. Now, all these laws, as was to be expected, were accompanied by an ever-increasing erosion of the rule of law, under which, according to the great constitutional lawyer, Dicey, the British constitutional lawyer, to paraphrase, no man is punishable or can lawfully be made to suffer in body or goods except for a distinct breach of law established in the ordinary legal manner before the ordinary courts of the land. In other words, the definition implies equality before the law, the right to public trial before a proper court with properly stated charges, which must be properly proved, and the right of the accused to legal defense must also, of course, be included in that definition. I said, as was to be expected, the spate of apartheid laws was accompanied by an ever-increasing erosion of the rule of law. And I said that because if laws are passed which are not acceptable to the majority of the people to whom they apply, the normal process of the law will not suffice to maintain law and order. A one-time professor at the University of Witwatersrand, Professor Lewin, summed up the position as such: the theory of human equality, which inspires the rule of law, and the theory of racial separation, which inspires the South African government, have come into collision over and over again. A government determined at all costs to enforce apartheid in the teeth of all legal and practical difficulties will abandon the rule of law. And that precisely is what has happened in South Africa. The consent of the majority, that is the black population of South Africa, has not been obtained, and therefore the rule of law has had to be abandoned. Since 1950, the Statute Book of South Africa has been burdened with law after law, with amending bill after amending bill, undermining the rule of law. The fons et origo of such laws was the Suppression of Communism Act of 1950, amended over and over again, giving ever wider powers to the Minister of Justice to restrict people, to prohibit them from attending gatherings, which, by the way, are defined as more than 2 persons, prohibiting people from leaving magisterial districts, from being quoted, from entering factories or educational institutions. And to give you some idea of how this law is, in fact, implemented, some months ago I went to visit Winnie Mandela, the wife of Nelson Mandela. She has been restricted to the magisterial district of Brantford, which is a very small little town in the Orange Free State, some 50 miles from Bloemfontein. And I went to visit Winnie, having obtained a permit to visit her at her home, because she is house arrested, which means that while she may leave her home between certain hours, she may not have anybody visit her at her home except her doctor in case of health problems. And Winnie is restricted to the house from the hours of 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. and over the weekends from 6 p.m. on a Friday until 6 a.m. on a Monday. So I went to visit Winnie. I flew to Bloemfontein, picked up a car at the airport and drove to see her with my permit clutched in my hot little hand. And we had been talking for about half an hour when there was a knock on the door and two men burst in and they said, "You're breaking the terms of your restriction order." So I said, "Oh no, she's not. I have a permit." And the man who introduced himself as a security officer said, "Your permit is not in order. And unless you are out of here within 5 minutes, I am going to arrest Mrs. Mandela." Well, I was not anxious, of course, for Winnie to be arrested, although I was very well prepared, I might say, to fight this out had it not been so. And I said to Winnie, "Well, come on, let's go and talk outside. They can't stop us from doing that." So we left her house and we spent the other half an hour that I had with her talking outside her house in the road. And I then left and went back home. And I might tell you, kicked up hell with the Minister of Justice, who told me that technically speaking, my permit had not been in order because I had applied for it and not Mrs. Mandela. So that is the sort of limit to which they can go when they intend to harass a person under these so-called security laws. I might say that in 1976, the Suppression of Communism Act was replaced by the Internal Security Act, which took over all the previous powers and indeed increased them by allowing the minister to detain people under the Preventive Detention Clause. There are 14 people presently being held in jail under the Preventive Detention Clause. This means they can be held. Habeas corpus does not apply. Nobody has access to them unless permission is given by the prison authorities. They are not, however, held in solitary confinement, and generally speaking, their relatives are allowed to visit them. In 1962, the Sabotage Act was passed, which actually introduced the house arrest clause. In 1963, the 90-day law allowing detention without trial in jail for 90 days was the first true abrogation of habeas corpus. I might say I was the only member of Parliament who voted against that bill when it was introduced in Parliament. The law was suspended in 1966, but in the 3 years that it was being implemented, over 1,000 people were detained under the 90-day law. 10 people died in detention during that time. That particular law also introduced what is known as the Sobukwe Clause, because it only ever was applied to one man, Robert Sobukwe, who was the head of the Pan-African Congress, who spent an additional 6 years in jail on Robben Island after the 3-year sentence had passed, which was imposed on him by the courts of law after Sharpeville for his part in so-called incitement against the pass laws. In 1967 came the worst of all the laws, the Terrorism Act, which again, I might say, I was the only MP to oppose. Section 6 of that act gives immense powers to the minister and to a senior police officer to impose indefinite detention in solitary confinement for purposes of interrogation. Innumerable people have been detained under this law. We do not know the exact number because the authorities are absolved from giving information if they do not wish to. There is no access whatever to them, including the courts, no access by the courts to people detained under Section 6 of the Terrorism Act. 33 people have died in detention under the Terrorism Act. Mostly, I might say, their deaths have been attributed to suicide by the authorities. Steve Biko, however, was killed while being held under Section 6. Steve Biko's death served perhaps one purpose. Nobody has died in detention since Steve Biko died. When that happened and the furor that occurred thereafter, not only in South Africa but throughout the world, the word went out, be careful. 2 watchdogs were appointed to visit people in detention under Section 6 to make sure that they were being kept in reasonable health. So that has been the result of the tragic death of Steve Biko. There are other consequences to the abrogation of the rule of law. Firstly, let me tell you, it tends to be used in ever-increasing ways. I remember that when these bills were introduced in Parliament, there were ministerial assurances They would only be used in specific cases where terrorism was suspected. The Terrorism Act was introduced, it was said, because of the difficulties of the police in tracing terrorists in the bush in South Africa. Well, in the event, of course, the Terrorism Act has been used. It was used against the Dean of Johannesburg, who no doubt was behind a rose bush in the deanery. It was used in Soweto against thousands of young students during the unrest, because, you see, it is so much easier simply to say, I arrest you under Section 6 of the Terrorism Act, and then hold indefinitely, and most people, I may say, are subsequently released without being charged, though a number of people have been charged. Some indeed have been found guilty, others have been acquitted. Many of the people who were defended, and we now have an excellent system of defense for people like this under the legal resources and other firms that have been set up fairly recently, and I might say with the help of foundations in this country, people who have been defended have very often been acquitted of the charges. But it's much easier, as I say, to arrest people under these measure like Section 6 than to have to go through all the tedious processes of the normal rule of law, produce people in court after 48 hours under the habeas corpus law, and have charges ready for them. The second unfortunate effect I have noticed is that South Africans have tended to become punch drunk. They react less and less as law after law of this kind is put on the statute book. Their threshold of tolerance appears to rise every time there is an incursion into the rule of law. They have really become inured to the loss of their civil rights. And thirdly, pari passu with the erosion of the rule of law has been the growth of administrative law in South Africa at the expense of judicial authority. The South African Constitution, in fact, proclaims the independence of the Supreme Court. It has always been the most highly respected institution in the land, and its integrity and impartiality has been widely accepted both at home and abroad without question. Today, however, the Supreme Court, according to a judge of that court, has been robbed of its inherent jurisdiction by statutes which lay down mandatory sentences that deprive the court of its discretion, by giving administrative officers indemnity from prosecution in certain instances. And these steps, taken together with all the statutes which I have already described to you that undermine habeas corpus, have greatly diminished the role of the Supreme Court over the years. Furthermore, the judge alleges, and I may say that his allegations have been widely supported by the legal profession, which hitherto has not been nearly vocal enough on many of these issues, the Department of Justice, which was designed to be the servant of the Supreme Court, has, he says, become its master. It is, and I quote, suspected of having a weighty voice on appointments to and promotions within the judiciary. And there is no doubt that many prominent senior members of the bar in South Africa have been overlooked in appointments to the bench, and that senior judges have been bypassed in promotions. I must add, in all fairness, that many of these people have been approached and have refused to go on the bench, some for financial reasons, because judges certainly are not that well paid in South Africa, but some too because they find it very hard to implement the laws which have been passed by the South African Parliament. Now, the judge and some of his colleagues believe that there are proposals afoot which are aimed at subverting the authority of the Supreme Court and promoting the domination of the state over everybody and everything, including the Supreme Court. And should this happen, yet another bulwark protecting human rights, perhaps the most important, apart from the freedom of the press, will have disappeared in South Africa. Visitors to South Africa are usually very impressed with the degree of press freedom that exists in the country. And certainly, compared with the black states of Africa and other authoritarian countries, open criticism of the government that is found in the daily press is remarkable. The editorials, the forthright criticism of government action, letters from readers, the English medium press has been a great bulwark protecting what human rights there are in South Africa. But nevertheless, the freedom of the press has been under constant attack since the national government came to power. And one editor describes his work as picking his way through a minefield of restrictive legislation. Both the Prisons Act and the Police Act impose heavy penalties on a newspaper which publishes false information about the prisons or the police, and it lays the onus of proof of verification of the report on the newspaper, and this is a very difficult thing to prove. The enormous costs of fighting court cases against the state has proved a very effective deterrent to the press, to the publication of news concerning prisons and police, and thus an important factor discouraging the abuse of power, and that is public scrutiny, has been curtailed in South Africa. Some years ago, the state brought a case against Lawrence Gander and Benjamin Pogrund of the Ront Daily Mail, an excellent, forthright, outright critic of the government, in which they published a number of articles on prison conditions in South Africa at the time. They were found guilty of publishing false facts in one or two instances out of a number of other accusations against the prison authorities. And Gander was fined a small amount and given a suspended short prison sentence, and so was Pogrund. But it wasn't that so much which has deterred every editor ever since. It was the 3 years that it took before the case was completed in the courts, and the 300,000 rand that fighting that case cost the newspaper proprietors. So you will see that people are very wary indeed about publishing information about prisons and police, and this is really where I come in again, because what I say in Parliament may be published without fear of the government taking any action. So Parliament is a very useful forum in that regard. There are also a number of other acts that place strictures on the press in reporting. For instance, one cannot report items which may incite racial friction, and that's quite a large variety, as you can imagine. No person who has been banned under the Internal Security Act, like Winnie Mandela, can be quoted. No person, be he dead or alive, living in South Africa or abroad, may be quoted in the press if he is banned or placed on a special list under the Internal Security Act. And I may say, if anything, there have been ominous signs of further incursions into the freedom of the press. 2 years ago in South Africa, we had our Watergate, known as the Muldergate, the information scandal. And there have been since then the threat of severe restrictions on the press in the form of a bill which was introduced but then withdrawn because, to their everlasting credit, the Afrikaans press, the press that normally supports the government, put up a howl of protest. So the bill was withdrawn. Had it gone onto the statute book, it would have been the end of all investigative journalism in South Africa. It did not, in fact, go on the statute book. Indeed, the resemblance between Watergate and Muldergate is quite startling. We had our Woodward and Bernstein. We had our Judge Sarika. We had our John Dean. And we had our Deep Throat. All these characters which operated in your Watergate operated in our Muldergate, Mulder being the name of the Minister of Information after whom Muldergate was named. And I might say also that, as in your case, the scandal resulted in the resignation of a president. The state president had to resign as a result of our information scandal. At the present time, there is a commission of inquiry sitting into the workings of the press, and we are awaiting its findings with some trepidation. Well, so much for the past and the present. What can be expected in the foreseeable future in South Africa? Are meaningful changes in the offing? Can one project any optimistic forecasts? Will we get back to the rule of law? Will human rights be restored? Well, let me say at once that there have already been some changes, important changes in government attitudes and policy. For instance, the permanency of the black urban population has at last been conceded. Up till now, the government has been following a policy of believing that all the blacks living in the so-called white urban areas are one day going to return to their rural homelands. I remember when Dr. Verwoerd, years ago, when he was Prime Minister, predicted that by 1978, all the blacks would be streaming out of the cities back to the rural areas. Why he said 1978, he never told us. I remember saying to him, I think this will never happen, but if it does happen, you will call out the army to stop them, because who is going to run your industry and your mines if all the blacks go back to the rural areas? But of course, 1978 has come and gone, and the flow of blacks still, in fact, is from the rural areas where they are able to get into the urban areas of South Africa. But at last, the government has conceded the permanency. The monthly leasehold, which was all that Africans could obtain for their houses in the black townships, now has been changed, and they can obtain 99-year leasehold. Secondly, the very urgent need to train blacks for skilled work has at last been recognized, and the job reservation law has been repealed for manufacturing industry, though it still remains on the mines because there's a very strong right-wing white trade union on the mines which has fought any changes as far as job reservation on the mines are concerned. Today, however, in industry, apprenticeship of blacks in the skilled trades is encouraged, and in-service training incentives, tax incentives, are being given to entrepreneurs. Vocational training institutions are being built, and membership of registered trade unions is at last open to black workers. Thirdly, far greater amounts than ever before have been allocated now to black education and black housing, and the government is beginning to phase in, for the first time, compulsory education for black children. Now, much of all this is due to the sheer pressure of economic forces. You will readily understand that South Africa is presently enjoying an economic boom when you think that the price of gold was $35 an ounce only a few years ago, and today it's somewhere in the $600 an ounce bracket. And gold happens to be our biggest earner of foreign exchange. We do have a number of other very important so-called strategic raw materials which we export: vanadium, chrome, uranium, copper, coal, and so on. It is a very rich country indeed as far as natural resources is concerned. And simply because the country is now really experiencing this economic boom, it is realized that it is quite impossible for the 4.5 to 5 million whites to supply all the skills necessary to develop these great resources of the country. Some of it, of course, is also due to the fact that people have begun to realize in government circles that South Africa can ill afford to have another Soweto, another outbreak of widespread unrest, which caused so much damage to the country some 2 years ago. And I might say the prophetic words uttered by a well-known economic historian, Dr. de Kiewit, who presently has been living in the United States for a long time, but is a South African. He said many years ago that South Africa advances politically by disasters and economically by windfalls. And this seems to be so true today, because Soweto was the disaster by which certain advances have been made, as a result of which, and of course the windfall is the price of gold. Now, I must say, too, that some of the rigid inflexibility of the 60s and early 70s have been relaxed as far as aspects of freedom of association are concerned. And thus today, the hotels in South Africa can acquire what is known as international status by permits which enable them to admit black guests who may swim in the hotel pool but may not dance in the hotel disco. Now, do not ask me to explain the rationale of this. I think it's got something to do with vertical as against horizontal integration. Many of the public amenities like parks and libraries and post offices are now desegregated in the large centres. The offensive whites-only signs have been removed. Today there are about 1,000 black pupils at private white schools, and there are well over 3,000 black students at the so-called white universities. Offences under the Immorality Act are only pursued after attorneys general have inspected the cases prior to prosecution. P.W. Botha, the Prime Minister, has called for suggestions as to how to lessen the impact of this insulting piece of legislation. And one wag in my party suggested that Friday night be made international night. It's been a suggestion not, I might say, accepted by the government. In the sports field, perhaps the most far-reaching changes have taken place. Pressures from abroad and South Africa's desire to be readmitted to internal sporting events have resulted in the admission of black sportsmen at all levels, club level, national level, and international level. But, and it is an enormous but, all these changes have come about via the permit system, somewhat furtively. There's been no repeal of the various laws that would have made association across the colour line a right. The Separate Amenities Act, the University Education Act, the Immorality Act, the Group Areas Act remain on the statute book inviolate. The Population Registration Act, which is a race classification act, has not been repealed. And by and large, I have to say that the life of the average black man in South Africa is as yet unaffected by all these changes, many of which he considers to be cosmetic and of far less importance than white South Africans consider them, such as the international hotels and theatres and sports clubs. And many of the things which will benefit blacks, such as improvement in housing and education, have not yet, in fact, been achieved. The daily life of the black man is still full of harassments, badly overcrowded dwellings and transport, heavy hikes in rentals, rapidly increasing cost of living, wages not keeping up, although increasing, not keeping up with the cost of living, and of course the pass laws, the laws that inhibit the mobility of black people. 1980 was supposed to be the year of reform. It was eagerly awaited. We all went down to Parliament this last session from January to June, hoping to have a lot of good repealing legislation coming up. And we felt that way because Dr. Koornhof, who is the Minister of Black Affairs, or Cooperation and Development as it is officially known, had spoken to audiences here in the United States last year, I may say 9,000 safe miles away from the right wing of his own caucus. But anyway, he had made a number of promises, and I'm afraid his promises so far anyway have proved to be a sad disappointment, despite his declaration here in the US that the government of South Africa will not rest until race discrimination has disappeared from the statute book and from everyday life in South Africa. And I may say that partly as a result of expectations which were raised but not fulfilled, 1980 has been a year of unrest in South Africa. There have been school children boycotting the schools. There have been passengers boycotting the buses because there have been an increase in the bus fares. There have been strikes in various industries. There have been other promises of reform that have been emanating both from the Prime Minister and Dr. Koornhof, and we are told that the Prime Minister has now reformed his cabinet so as to reinforce the so-called enlightened wing of that cabinet. And we are told that a number of unnecessary laws will be scrapped in the 1981 parliamentary session. Dr. Koornhof has already produced some draft bills that are supposed to ameliorate the pass laws, under which over 250,000 people, by the way, were arrested the year before last. I haven't got the figures for last year. I will get them when I get to Parliament. That's another use I have as an opposition member, is I put a lot of questions to ministers, and I may say I'm often castigated for the questions that I put, and I was told that I put these questions in order to provide ammunition for South Africa's enemies abroad. And my answer to that one is that it's not my questions that provide the ammunition, it's the answers that I get provide the ammunition. Now, I can't say that there's been any let-up in the abrogations of the rule of law. There is a commission which is presently examining South Africa's security legislation, presumably with a view to amending it for the better. This commission has not yet reported, and there is no sign as yet that South Africa will return to the rule of law. The path thereto, that is consensus government, I cannot emphasize this enough, is beset with difficulties. There has been a parliamentary commission on constitutional reform, and as a result of this, there has been a President's Council established of 60 members, nominated members, consisting of white, coloured, Indian and Chinese members, but excluding Africans, who compose 70% of the total population. We, the official opposition, have completely rejected serving on this President's Council for the reason that it does not include Africans. It has also been rejected by the official representatives of the coloured people, Indians and blacks. But there are coloured and Indian members and Chinese and a Malay member who are in fact serving on that particular council. But without consensus government, there can be no return to the rule of law and the establishment of human rights in South Africa. Instead of a government acting with the authority that flows naturally from the consent of free men, there is authoritarian government, which is a very different thing indeed. Now, you may wonder what opposition there has been in South Africa over all these years as this jigsaw puzzle has been completed. Well, there has been opposition in Parliament and outside Parliament. There has been white opposition and there has been black opposition. There was the passive resistance movement of the blacks from 1948 up to Sharpeville in 1960. Then there was the underground resistance movement led by the African National Congress from 1960 in South Africa till about 1965, when the entire leadership of the blacks was either arrested, tried and jailed, or went into exile, whence the ANC now still operates. And there is the period from the 60s to the present day. And this period saw the emergence of what was known as the Black Consciousness Movement, which was headed by Steve Biko, essentially a black student organization which started at the black universities, spread to the schools, and used a number of organizational vehicles to conscientize the community, the black community. It was, I must tell you, constantly harassed by the security police. Many of the leaders were banned or detained, but continued really until every single black consciousness organization was banned in October 1977, shortly after Biko died in detention. And I may say that a number of the leading citizens of Soweto, such as Dr. Motlana, the head of the Committee of 10, were held under the preventive detention clause of the Internal Security Act. Now, meantime, Soweto had erupted in June 76 with riots which sparked off by an attempt to enforce Afrikaans as a teaching medium in the black schools. I may say I was here. It was the year that Harvard gave me my honorary doctorate, the day, in fact, that Harvard gave me my honorary doctorate. Rather spoilt the whole business for me, as you can imagine. But when I got back to South Africa, I had one of my usual confrontations with the Minister of Justice, Mr. Kruger, of the fame, It Leaves Me Cold, when he heard that Steve Biko had died. I had one of my usual confrontations with him, and he turned on me and he said, "And where was the honourable member for Houghton," that's me, "when all the trouble broke out? She was in America, collecting degrees from obscure universities." Well, I might say that the Soweto continued for 2 terrible years with a great deal of bloodshed and loss of life, enormous damage to property. Something like 600 to 700 young people were killed. A large number of people were injured. There were hundreds of arrests, trials and jailings for sabotage and for public violence. And by the time the unrest ended, I have to say that the vast majority of young blacks were embittered and radicalized. Several thousand fled the country, are in Black Africa and elsewhere. Some are continuing their education. Others, it is believed, are receiving military training. I think it is generally accepted in South Africa that there will be increasing urban violence. There have been attempts at major sabotage, one of which inflicted considerable damage to Sasol, an oil from coal government installation. But stringent countermeasures have now been taken to ensure security at all key points, as they are known. Of the homeland leaders, only one, Gatsha Buthelezi of KwaZulu, head of the largest black ethnic group, has attempted to form any kind of power base. Chief Buthelezi revived Inkatha, which was a Zulu cultural organization that existed in the 20s and today claims a membership of some 350,000. Although his organization is rurally based in KwaZulu, it has expanded into the urban areas and has become a power base of very considerable importance. Buthelezi is an outspoken opponent of apartheid. He is firmly against opting for independence for KwaZulu, as he believes this will deny his people their legitimate share in the wealth of South Africa, which he rightly says they have helped to develop. But the urban areas, the blacks in the urban areas, disapprove of all the homeland leaders because they feel they are acting within the system. Indeed, all of us who live in South Africa, willy-nilly, are acting within the system. The white opposition, of course, is to be found mainly in Parliament in my party, which is the official opposition of 16 in a House of 165 members. There is another small party known as the New Republic Party, which is the remnant of General Smuts' old party, which has 10 members, but which very often, I'm afraid, votes with the government on contentious issues. The government, please remember, has been in power since 1948. It must be the most entrenched government in the Western world. Now, there is, of course, opposition, white opposition, outside the parliamentary system. It's to be found in splendid organizations like the Black Sash. It's to be found among the students of the English medium universities, and it's to be found in the Institute of Race Relations. All these organizations profess, by the way, to be multiracial, but they are predominantly white. And for your interest, the church is playing an increasingly militant role in opposition in South Africa. There has been an ecumenical movement which has developed, formed by the English-speaking churches and the black churches, some of which belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church, which is the official church of the Afrikaans section of the population, Calvinist in nature. And the Council of Churches, which belongs to this ecumenical movement, has issued what is known as its message to the people of South Africa, which declared that the government's policy of apartheid is against the Christian doctrine, that and the government, I might say, has taken action against the English churches using deportation, visa refusals, passport refusals, and bannings as its weapons. One of the people who was banned is one of South Africa's really great dissidents, the Reverend Beyers Naudé, who left the Dutch Reformed Church in 1960 to form the anti-government Christian Institute and thereby forfeited the moderatorship of the immensely powerful Dutch Reformed Church. Both Beyers Naudé and the Christian Institute were banned in 1977. The South African Council of Churches has adopted an increasingly uncompromising attitude and has recently come close to a call for civil disobedience. Now, I must tell you that it has become fashionable for radicals in South Africa to say that white politics are irrelevant. I do not agree with that attitude. I believe white politics are relevant in South Africa because whites are in power in South Africa, and they are likely to remain in power for a considerable time to come, despite increasing urban unrest. It is what whites do with that power, whether they use it to good effect and how they share it, that is the major issue today. And the major issue today will be the determining factor as to what the South Africa of tomorrow will be like. And I believe that it is the white opposition's task to keep issues alive, to allow nothing to go by default, to exert constant pressure for change. In other words, to speak out. As Sakharov said, if a man does not keep silent, it does not mean that he hopes necessarily to achieve something. He may hope for nothing, but nonetheless speak, because he cannot, simply cannot, remain silent. And of course, this applies also to dissidents in South Africa. But I believe that in a country like South Africa, which does have some democratic institutions and does have a parliamentary system for whites, speaking out can achieve more than it can do in Soviet Russia. The politics of protest, for that is what it largely is, has had positive effects in a limited way in South Africa. Squatter camps were not razed to the ground because of protest. Conditions under which detainees are held are less inhuman because of protest. Exposure of the information scandal led, as I said, to the resignation of the state president. None of this means, however, that I'm one of those who believes that South Africa is on the brink of fundamental change. I think it is going to take years just to get back to square one. That is, a South Africa minus the many laws that entrench race discrimination on the statute book and that infringe human rights. And even then, it'll take many more years to implement real equality of opportunity for all races. I think you in America have experienced the very same thing. Even after your civil rights legislation of the 60s was passed, even after all anti-discriminatory laws were made invalid, I think you will agree that it still has taken a long time and still has not been achieved. That is, equal opportunity for all races in this country. I think change in South Africa will be inhibited by the white backlash, which scares the politicians in power, and by the huge army of bureaucrats who are not easily diverted from policies which they have been implementing for over 30 years. Change will be influenced by what happens in the black states surrounding South Africa, Mozambique, Namibia, and most of all Zimbabwe. For that country, like South Africa, has a settled white population and a developed economy on a much smaller scale than South Africa, however. But how Mugabe copes and to what extent he retains the confidence of the whites who remain in Zimbabwe will undoubtedly affect the willingness of white South Africans to accept black participation in the political power structure. And I must say the decision on Takeri really made my heart sink when I read about it in the newspaper. Change, I believe, in South Africa will be propelled forward by international pressures, by pressures from within, mainly from blacks, but also from whites. Pressures will be both violent and non-violent pressures, and pressures will come from white South Africans, Afrikaans-speaking South Africans, as well as English-speaking, because I do not wish you to go away with the impression tonight that all English-speaking whites in South Africa are liberals and all Afrikaans-speaking whites are government supporters. On the contrary, the leader of my own party is an Afrikaner. 6 of our 16 members of parliament are Afrikaners, and there are thousands of Afrikaners in the universities and elsewhere who today are rethinking the whole situation, who realize that the solution which was offered in the name of separate development has been tested and found wanting, has failed in fact, and that the reality of multiracialism must be accepted and accommodated if peaceful change is to come in South Africa. And finally, and I'm sure you hear that word with a deep sigh of relief, finally, I must emphasize that there are no simple solutions, no instant solutions to what is an immensely complicated problem. I'm often asked in South Africa, what can the United States do to hasten the pace of change in South Africa? Maybe now, since November the 4th, the question should be, what does the United States want to do about South Africa? Maybe we should wait and see what the new administration wants to do. But this much I can tell you, there's no simple answer to the question. It's bound up with a number of moral and economic and other considerations. And also, I might tell you, the answer to the question differs according to the aim of the questioner. Does he seek to punish, or does he seek reform? And it seems to me that instead of just drawing up hit lists of possible reprisals against South Africa, concerned foreigners could be more usefully engaged in helping to make positive and constructive proposals to solve a problem of great complexity. How, in fact, does one bring about full participation for all, with South Africa's racial composition without all political power passing to the overwhelming black majority? How can the rights of minorities be best protected in a society of widely disparate ethnic and cultural backgrounds with no long-established consensus as to how the society should be run? We in South Africa, and I may say of all parties, and some with more success than others, are wrestling with these difficult questions. But if anyone in this audience has any realistic or equitable solution relevant to the conditions and circumstances of South Africa, All contributions will be gratefully received. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, and our distinguished guest, I think that applause, Helen Suzman, indicates to you that possibly my introduction of you was not fulsome enough. Despite her very lucid account of what goes on in her country, Mrs. Suzman has very graciously agreed that she would answer questions. Fact is, in her address said she was getting ready some questions to raise in Parliament. So she's no amateur at asking questions or at answering questions. Also, and there's also to be a reception later in the art gallery. With regard to what you've just heard, some time ago, Samuel Johnson got famous through a tour of London with Colonel Syntax. I think I might equally say you have been privileged to hear a tour of South Africa with South Africa's modern-day de Tocqueville. If you have any questions, she will very graciously answer them. I don't know what the lineup is between these.
Well, would you come closer?
Oh, indeed I would. I'm being chaperoned by a member of the audience.
Ah, that's better.
What questions have you?
That's better. There's somebody
I would
else.
like to ask the first question.
Can you see me? There's somebody over there.
All right, you point them. I was
Oh,
taught-
right. Gentleman right over there. I was
Gentleman,
taught to
you're
point.
next. Gentleman over there?
I have one question. Is there anything being done in South Africa to help Uganda, to help poor people in Uganda? Is there any...
Look, I was coached. The question is, has anything been done or is anything being done in South Africa to help Uganda?
Well, not to my knowledge, but South Africa has offered technical assistance and technological know-how and so on to all the black states. Some have used it, some have not, but I don't know anything about any specific aid to Uganda. They may be giving it, but I don't know of it.
This gentleman over there has a question.
Mr. Suzman, I have a three-part question. First, have you been attacked in Parliament as a Jew? Secondly, what is the role of the Jewish community in South Africa in these civil rights problems? And thirdly, what is the role of Israel in relation to South Africa?
The question is, has Mrs. Suzman been attacked in Parliament as a Jewess? Secondly, what has the Jewish community in South Africa done? And third, as I gather, what is the relationship with Israel?
Well, to the first question, there was a time when there was a good deal of anti-Semitic interjections. There were a number of anti-Semitic interjections whenever I got up to speak. One backbencher used to say, "Oh, there's the Yiddish mama again," and another one used to say, "Go back to Israel." But I must tell you, after the Six-Day War, Israel was too good for me. It was go back to Moscow after that. That sort of remark. But on the whole, it's really largely died away, and I get very little of that. And there are three other Jewish members in Parliament, and occasionally, in the heat of a debate, somebody will make a remark which is clearly of an anti-Semitic nature, but on the whole not. The second question, the Jews don't vote as a bloc. By the way, I mean, there are not very many Jews in South Africa. They're fairly prominent, I know, but that's because they're jolly hard-working, like my father was. And they have done very well in their professions and so on. But there are only about, I think, 112 to 114,000 Jews in the whole country. I think you could lose them in a corner of Brooklyn. And they don't vote as a bloc, but by and large, I would say they support the party that I represent. My own constituency has got a large number of Jews living in Houghton, and I have always had their support, although on the very first occasion that I stood as a progressive, I was opposed by another Jewish candidate, and I won only by 564 votes, so it wasn't what you'd call a shoe-in. But they don't vote. We've even had a Jew stand as a National Party candidate at the last election. So they don't really vote as a bloc. But they're interested in civil rights, and it always strikes me as extraordinary that Jews could in any way not support a party that is fighting to remove race discrimination, as my own party is. The third, the relationship between Israel and South Africa. It's a close relationship. The countries are exchanging with each other what they need, and it's a very friendly relationship. And the Jews in South Africa, I think, have found the government sympathetic to their efforts to, for instance, send money to support Zionism. It's a question of technical know-how and raw materials. I think it's an exchange.
Question over there?
Mrs. Suzman, the justification of many black nations in their hostility against Israel has been that Israel has considerable relationship, commercial and otherwise, with South Africa. Could you, however, tell us, is it true that many of these same black nations, Zaire, Mozambique, and others, sub rosa, without mentioning it in public, maintain very important and considerable trade relations with South Africa themselves?
Oh, yes, without a doubt. There is trade between South Africa and the black states of Africa. Many of them buy, force majeure, if you like, but they buy from South Africa because they get things much more cheaply there, and certain things they can only get from South Africa, and they do get them. And I might say there's a very good economic relationship, pragmatic, if you like, enlightened self-interest, call it what you like, between Michel of Mozambique and South Africa. The South Africans help to run the railways and harbours of Mozambique. We are the biggest buyer of power from the hydroelectric scheme of Cabora Bassa in Mozambique, and we take something like 40 to 50,000 black workers per annum who come to work on the South African mines and thereby take deferred pay back to Mozambique. And I think Mugabe has announced his firm intention of maintaining economic relations with South Africa and Zimbabwe, and of course all the satellite countries around South Africa, like Swaziland, Botswana, Lesotho, Malawi, all have their ties, their economic ties. Southern Africa is one economic unit, but there is trade also with the territories further to the north. There's no question.
Question back there?
Yes, I'd like to ask you the charges raised against Nelson Mandela and whether you think he's had a proper trial.
Oh yes, he had a proper trial, there's no question, and he was brilliantly defended too. But Nelson Mandela in fact admitted that he was part of a conspiracy to overthrow the state. Shall I say, campaign, really, on behalf of Nelson Mandela, apart from improvement in prison conditions, which really have improved enormously since I was last there, is to get remission of sentence. Because nobody who's been convicted of one of these so-called crimes against the state gets any remission of sentence at all in South Africa. It's much better to commit a crime such as a murder or rape or assault or a robbery. You get a remission of sentence.
There's a question over there.
I understand that South Africans who want to emigrate to Israel are not allowed to take out more than a certain amount of money. Is that true?
Oh yes, there's exchange control, but if you want to emigrate to Australia or the United States or Britain or Canada, you still can't take out all the money you want to. There is a limit to the amount of money that each emigrant may take. It's recently been raised, by the way, from 30,000 rand, which is roughly, add another third, say $40,000. It's been raised to 100,000 rand, $130,000. But then you have to deduct a discount because it's done via what is known as the financial rand. But there's no difference in immigration to Israel and immigration to any other country. The same rule applies for every country.
I think there's a question over there.
Is it our obligation as Jews to end by all means this Nazi-like system in South Africa instead of playing and looking for excuses very often as we do?
Well, that's up to you to decide. That's a moral question which you must decide for yourself.
Yes, ma'am? A little louder because I can't hear.
Is it my turn now?
Yeah.
Okay. Mrs. Suzman, you referred to Namibia as a black
No, that's
adjoining
incorrect.
South Africa. It is not a sovereign state, as you know.
No, you're quite right. That was a mistake.
I spoke with you the other night.
You did? Ah, yes, yes, I remember you now. Yes. Now, may I just first say, you're quite right. I shouldn't have said Namibia as a black state, but what happens in Namibia, which is very imminent, as you know, because there's a meeting set down for January 7th, is very important for what will happen in South Africa.
May I suggest, Miss, if this is a question, fine. If it's a speech,
No, it's a question.
all right.
In view of the fact that it is not a state, can you tell me the position of your party, the PFP, regarding internal settlement, regarding internationally recognized solution, and regarding what you think of the possibility of efficacy
Of what?
of a conference with all the parties participating?
Oh, I'm in favour. In favour of a conference with all the parties participating. In fact, that's what January the 7th is all about. And to the best of my knowledge, our party favours an internationally accepted settlement in Namibia.
With UN participation?
With what?
With or without the participation of the United Nations?
Well, somebody's got to supervise the elections, obviously. And we presume that out of the January the 7th discussions, this is the sort of thing which is going to be decided on. Right.
Question back there.
As you have said, in South Africa, and I think that is really the root of the problem, there are 5 million whites and approximately 80 million blacks. Now, I have no great sympathy for the apartheid government, but I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the average South African white. Isn't there a tremendous fear of being overwhelmed by the large black majority? And how do you address this fear, and how do you come to a solution where the whites can live in a country where the franchise is equally distributed among all people?
Yes, well, I mean, my own party has applied itself to this very complex problem, and we have suggested a policy which we believe and hope would work. First of all, we do not believe that denying people franchise is going to make it easier to live with the black majority. I mean, there they are, and this has just got to be accepted. South Africa is a multiracial country where the majority of people are black. And you cannot go on denying participation in the political power structure of the country. This is what leads to urban unrest and ultimately to much more widespread unrest. And my party proposes a universal adult franchise for all citizens, irrespective of colour. We propose a national convention where we hope to get consensus government. I should put that first. We will bring to this negotiating table the suggestions, for instance, of a universal franchise, of a federal system of government rather than the present unitary system that we have, in other words, a system such as the one that you have here, where you allow for differences in the states, but you have a federal government which oversees things like international trade, the fiscus, and matters of that kind, defence. And that's what we propose, together with a Bill of Rights, which we do not have at the present stage, and Americans should bless the day that the founders thought of the Bill of Rights, a Bill of Rights which will protect, we hope, individuals and minorities against oppression or laws which discriminate against them. They could be challenged in the courts of law. We have a further mechanism which we think will protect minority groups, which is a minority veto of any law which is passed, which something like 15 to 20% of the members of Parliament feel is discriminatory. They can veto it. They cannot veto money bills, so the country would continue to run, but they can veto discriminatory legislation. And finally, we propose 2 things. The one is proportional representation, rather than winner-take-all in a constituency, and that again helps to give minorities representation, and of course an independent judiciary, which is very important. Those are our major proposals. We would come to the negotiating table with those proposals, but the only 2 things really that are non-negotiable, as far as we are concerned, are no race discriminatory laws on the statute book, number 1, and secondly, no oppression by one group of another. For the rest, we're open to discussion. It's the only way it can be done, because we do all live together. Whether we like the situation or not, that is the status quo.
I think there's a question back there. That's it.
Mrs. Suzman,
feel any sympathy for the blacks in South Africa who feel despair at the so-called changes, the progress, and who turn to violence against the government?
Listen, I think sympathy is the wrong word. You know, first of all, I'm not sentimental about blacks at all. You know, I have a very practical streak in me, and the thing that motivates me is the desire for justice, really. I don't support violence. I mean, I cannot support violence. It goes against my own basic principles. Let us say I can understand. I can certainly understand that black people feel, A, disappointed at the changes that have taken place in view of the promises that have been made, and that I can also very well understand their impatience at the slow pace of change. And this is why I think it very important to push for change, meaningful change, as fast as possible.
There's a special right here.
Hi, there are many groups in the U.S. that push for U.S. corporations to get out of South Africa because by being there, they are supporting a discriminatory situation. In what ways do you see the U.S. corporate presence in South Africa helping or hurting non-whites? And would you like to see more or less U.S. investment in South Africa and why?
Do you want to repeat that? Did you all hear that? It's really basically a question on divestment or investment. Yeah, and the effects on non-whites, on South Africa generally. I mean, it isn't just, yeah.
I assume you're well aware of the Reverend Gordon's principles, which have been guiding most of the universities right here about investment.
Sullivan, yes.
Sullivan,
yes.
Sullivan.
Yes, indeed. Well, now, I mean, first of all, again, it depends on what the aim is. You know, what is the aim? Is the aim to try and reduce the country to economic chaos and thereby hope you'll promote a revolution and, you know, big change will come immediately? I'm not for that. I don't want the country reduced to economic chaos. I do want economic development of South Africa because it is my belief that it is only when black people become the skilled workers of South Africa and have economic muscle that they will really have a weapon which they can really use to not force, but shall I say demand and get further changes. They also then will become very important in the consumer demand field, such as blacks here were able to use in the South in the days before the civil rights legislation was on the statute book. So I believe that if it's a moral judgment, again, that you're asking me to give, I'm not going to give it. That's entirely up to you. If you feel that you'll be better off and your hands will be clean and you'll have nothing to do with an abhorrent system, that's entirely your own decision, and I don't presume to advise on that. I only tell you, you also lose influence when you go. Once you've gone, you've gone. And what you think about the system doesn't matter a row of beans. We may as well care what people on the mainland of China care. You know, I mean, think about the system. But if you're there and you use your influence to improve the whole basis of the working conditions of black people in South Africa, then you're doing something positive. And that's what I believe you must do. And I believe that, you know, the Sullivan principles to which Ben Buttenwieser has referred are being implemented, I believe, quite fairly satisfactorily in about 30% of the cases. This is according to the monitoring firm that is monitoring it. I believe another 30 are making progress, and the remainder are not satisfactory. So, I mean, the thing is to get in there and see that they do adhere to the Sullivan principles. Because don't forget, if they pull out, I mean, the vacuum is there, it is filled. The French come in, or the Japanese, or somebody else, you know. So rather have people there who care. That's the way I feel about it.
I think there's a question over there on the aisle. A little louder.
Yes, louder, please.
I'll try. In terms of the direction and leadership of the progressive dissent, could you define a little bit the role of the black organizations in that connection? And could you comment briefly on the relationship between the black and the white organizations within the framework of political dissent? I mention that incidentally because of some of the fragmentation and the uneasiness which has developed in the United States between some of the black and white.
Yes. Well, we used to have black members. We were a multiracial party. I mean, that's the whole basis of our formation. But I forgot to mention one little statute that was passed, which is called the Prohibition of Improper Interference Act, political. I used to think it was something against rape when I first saw the title, but turned out to be against people of other races belonging to parties mainly consisting of yet another race. So we had to suspend, and that is what we've done, our black members, and as soon as we possibly can, they'll come back again. But there is very constant contact between ourselves and the various black people, black leaders. Within Carter, for instance, we have a liaison. It is my job to keep contact with blacks in the urban areas, and I do that as best I can by talking to the leaders about every issue that comes up that I believe to be of importance. And they're constantly in touch with me and with other members of my party. But there is a growing, shall we say, disenchantment among the militant young blacks with any form of white liberalism or white organizations. I think you've experienced it in this country already, and we are experiencing it too. But the older generation are still very much concerned about finding a peaceful solution in South Africa. And I certainly have no problems at all about getting to talk to and to know the opinions of the black leaders in South Africa.
My coach, whom you just saw, evidently learned from the distinguished former president of Harvard, Charles Eliot, who once said, "There's no saving of souls after 10 o'clock at night." He told me time for 2 more questions. Who the fortunate 2 will be is a different choice. I'll leave it to you.
You leave it to me,
Yeah.
coward.
Point where you think there's...
Oh, gentleman right there makes it easy.
To what extent is intertribal conflict among the black population of the country a deterrent to progress in regard to civil rights?
Did you hear the question? To what extent is intertribal friction between the blacks in South Africa a deterrent to civil rights? Well, there's no intertribal friction. I mean, they live in their own areas if they're tribal, away from each other geographically, really. And in the urban areas, the tribalism has become a very unimportant thing. There's a very great deal of intermarriage across tribal lines in areas like Soweto. There were tribal faction fights on the mines. There still are sometimes. And a lot of people feel this is because they're kept in separate dormitories and they're able to sort of work up, intertribal rivalries and so on. But by and large, really, it's not an important factor. Although the government would have you believe they would all slaughter each other if they weren't there. It's not true.
The lady on this side of the footlights is going to have the last word. I think it's only fair a lady in the audience should have the last question.
Equal Rights Amendment.
Yeah.
Yes, there's one there.
Is there any evidence that Russia is taking advantage of the unrest and possibly funneling money into the areas where there is so much?
Is there any evidence that Russia is taking advantage of the unrest and funneling money? Well, of course, I think there's a lot of evidence, for instance, with the Cubans in Angola. There they are. And I mean, it's the Russians that got them there. And there's no doubt, I think, that the guerrilla movements are supplied with arms by Russia, and indeed in some cases by China. But at the same time, we mustn't let this, I think, blind us to the fact that there are very genuine grievances and that it's not because of communism and its sinister influence that the blacks in South Africa are dissatisfied. Indeed, the government of South Africa has done communism a great service by all these years equating everything that is anti-apartheid with communism. And they did a very stupid thing about it.
Well, a famous opera once ended with, "The play is over, go quietly home, but there's a reception."
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.